Chapter 16. God's preservation and support of the world by his power, and his government of every part of it by his providence. Firstly, although even the minds of impious men, by the mere contemplation of heaven and earth, are constrained to rise to a knowledge of the Creator, but practically stops at that, it is faith that leads us to a deeper knowledge of God. When it has learned that he is the creator of all things, it should immediately conclude that he is their perpetual governor and preserver. And that not by a general universal motion actuating the whole machine of the world, but by a particular providence sustaining, nourishing, and providing for everything which he has made. See Matthew chapter 10, verse 29. Matthew chapter 10, verse 29 says, "Are not 2 sparrows sold for a farthing? And one of them shall not fall on the ground without your Father." In general, both philosophers teach, and the minds of men conceive, that all parts of the world are quickened by the secret inspiration of God. But they go not so far as David, who was followed by all the pious, when he says, "These wait all upon thee, that thou mayest give them their meat in due season. That thou givest them, they gather. Thou openest thine hand, they are filled with good. Thou hidest thy face, they are troubled. Thou takest away their breath, they die and return to their dust. Thou sendest forth thy Spirit, they are created, and thou renewest the face of the earth." See Psalm chapter 104, verses 27 to 30. This special care of God, as seen by the eyes of faith, the philosophers have no apprehension. Secondly, it must be observed that the providence of God, according to the Scripture, is opposed to the erroneous notion that all things happen by chance. Carnal reason will ascribe all occurrences to fortune, whether prosperous or adverse, such as when one falls into the hands of a robber, or meets with wild beasts, or when another, wandering through deserts, finds relief, or, after having been tossed about by waves, reaches port. But whoever has been taught from the mouth of Christ that the hairs of his are numbered, see Matthew chapter 10, verse 30, will seek further cause, and conclude that all events are governed by the secret counsel of God. Matthew chapter 10, verse 30 says, "But the very hairs of your head are all numbered." Although the sun rises and sets in daily regularity, yet is this action not from a blind instinct of nature, but due to his governance. The miracles of Joshua's sun, standing still, see Joshua chapter 10, verse 13, and Hezekiah's retrograding 10 degrees, see 2 Kings chapter 20, verse 11, manifest God's power in providence. Joshua chapter 10, verse 13 says, "And the sun stood still, and the moon stayed, until the people had avenged themselves upon their enemies." Is not this written in the book of Jasher? So the sun stood still in the midst of heaven, and hasted not to go down about a whole day. 2 Kings chapter 20, verse 11 says, "And Isaiah the prophet cried unto the Lord, and he brought the shadow 10 degrees backward, by which it had gone down in the dial of Ahaz." And although the 4 seasons succeed one another, we discover that there are so many diversities in the succession that it is obvious that every year, month, and day is governed by a new and particular providence of God. Thirdly, this particular providence of God is not such as imagined by sophists, vain, idle and almost asleep, but vigilant, efficacious, operative, and engaged in continued action. It is not a general principle of confused motion, but governing and regulating all things in such a manner that nothing happens but according to his counsel. Thus, in adversity, the faithful should rather encourage themselves with this consolation, that they suffer no affliction but by the ordination of God, because they are under his hand. So it is puerile cavil to limit events to an uncontrolled course, according to a perpetual law of nature. This notion not only defrauds God of his glory, but them who hold it of a very useful doctrine. Those who recognize God's omnipotence in providence receive from this knowledge a double advantage. In the first place, they are consoled by his ample ability to bless them, and secondly, to protect them even against Satan with all his furies and machinations. For we are superstitiously timid, I say, if whenever creatures menace or terrify us, we are frightened, as though they had of themselves the power to hurt us, or as if, against their injuries, God were unable to afford us sufficient aid. In the doctrine of the providence of God, we are reminded that every creature, action, or motion is so governed by the secret counsel of God that nothing can happen but what is subject to his knowledge and decreed only by his will. Fourthly, first, then, let the readers know that what is called providence describes God not as idly beholding from heaven the transactions that happen in the world, but as holding the helm of the universe, regulating all events. Thus it belongs no less to his hands than to his eyes. When Abraham said to his son, God will provide, see Genesis chapter 22 verse 8, he intended not only to assert his prescience of a future event, but to leave the care of the thing unknown to the will of him who puts an end to circumstances of perplexity and confusion. Genesis chapter 22 verse 8 says, And Abraham said, My son, God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering. So they went both of them together. Thus providence consists not only of prescience, but also of action. Those who teach that God governs only by a general motion, without peculiarity directing the action of each individual creature, are quite erroneous and should not be tolerated. The Epicureans dream of a God absorbed in sloth and inactivity, while there are others, no less erroneous, who pretended that God's domination extended over the middle region of the air, but that he left inferior things to fortune. This makes him ruler in name, and not in reality. It is true that all things are actuated by a secret instinct of nature, as though they obeyed the eternal command of God, and that what God has once appointed appears to proceed from voluntary inclination in the creatures. This is under what is called general providence, even as St. Paul has asserted, in him we live and move and have our being. See Acts chapter 17 verse 28. But let this not obscure the doctrine of particular providence, which is also plainly asserted in Scripture. Acts chapter 17 verse 28 says, For in him we live and move and have our being, as certain also of your poets have said, for we are also his offspring. We shall prove that God attends to the government of particular events, and that they all proceed from his determinate counsel in such a manner that there can be no such thing as a fortuitous contingence. Fifthly, not only is the regularity of day and night, and of the changing of the 4 seasons, the work of God, but also excessive heats and drought, storms, and unseasonable rains, and other natural calamities. In the law and the prophets, he frequently declares that whenever he moistens the earth with dew or rain, he affords a testimony of his favor, and that, on the contrary, when the crops of corn are blasted and otherwise destroyed, he gives a proof of his certain and special vengeance. Not a drop of rain falls but at the express command of God. David indeed praises the general providence of God, because he giveth food to the young ravens which cry. See Psalm chapter 147, verse 9. But when God himself threatens animals with famine, does he not plainly declare that he withholds as he pleases? Psalm chapter 147, verse 9 says, He giveth to the beast his food, and to the young ravens which cry. God's particular acts of providence, even to the care of a sparrow, see Matthew chapter 10, verse 29, cannot be restrained. Matthew chapter 10, verse 29 says, Are not 2 sparrows sold for a farthing? And one of them shall not fall on the ground without your Father. Sixthly, but as we know that the world was made chiefly for the sake of mankind, we must observe this end in the government of it. Jeremiah exclaims, I know that the way of man is not in himself. It is not in man that walketh to direct his steps. See Jeremiah chapter 10, verse 23. Jeremiah chapter 10, verse 23 says, O Lord, I know that the way of man is not in himself. It is not in man that walketh to direct his steps. Man cannot predetermine on an end for himself without regard to God. Solomon says, The preparations of the heart in man, and the answer of the tongue, is from the Lord. See Proverbs chapter 16, verse 1. It is ridiculous madness for miserable men to resolve on undertaking any work independently of God, whilst they cannot even speak a word but what he chooses. That being the case, those things which appear most fortuitous, and what you would attribute to chance, are indeed acts of God. A falling branch of a tree that kills a passing traveller is to be regarded from the Lord, even the results in lot casting. The rich and poor are predetermined by the Lord, according to the psalmist. Promotion cometh neither from the east, nor from the west, nor from the south, but God is the judge. He putteth down one, and setteth up another. See Psalm chapter 75, verses 6 to 7. Seventhly, particular events are, in general, proof of the special providence of God. For example, the wind God raised to provide his people with a large flock of birds. See Exodus chapter 16, verse 13, and Numbers chapter 11, verse 31. And the wind he raised to cause Jonah to be thrown into the sea. See Jonah chapter 1, verse 4. Exodus chapter 16, verse 13 says, And it came to pass, that at even the quails came up and covered the camp, and in the morning the dew lay round about the host. Numbers chapter 11, verse 31 says, And there went forth a wind from the Lord, and brought quails from the sea, and let them fall by the camp, as it were a day's journey on this side, and as it were a day's journey on the other side, round about the camp, and as it were 2 cubits high upon the face of the earth. Jonah chapter 1 verse 4 says, But the Lord sent out a great wind into the sea, And there was a mighty tempest in the sea, so that the ship was like to be broken. In this respect, the psalmist declares the winds to be messengers, and his ministers a flame of fire. See Psalm chapter 104, verses 3 to 4. Psalm chapter 104, verses 3 to 4 says, Who layeth the beams of his chambers in the waters, who maketh the clouds his chariot, who walketh upon the wings of the wind, who maketh his angels spirits, his ministers a flaming fire. God's special providence is also seen in childbirths. Whilst men are naturally endued with a power to generation, he leaves some without posterity, and bestows children on others. The fruit of the womb is his reward. See Psalm chapter 127, verse 3. Psalm chapter 127, verse 3 says, Lo, children are an heritage of the Lord, and the fruit of the womb is his reward. Jacob understood this truth, who said to his wife, Am I in God's stead, who hath withheld from thee the fruit of the womb? See Genesis chapter 30, verse 2. Genesis chapter 30, verse 2 says, And Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel, and he said, Am I in God's stead, who hath withheld from thee the fruit of the womb? And so we quote from Psalm chapter 34, verses 15 and 16, God's dealings with the righteous and the evil, in helping the former and destroying the latter. Psalm chapter 34, verses 15 to 16 says, The eyes of the Lord are upon the righteous, and his ears are open unto their cry. The face of the Lord is against them that do evil, to cut off the remembrance of them from the earth. We conclude, therefore, not only that there is a general providence of God over his creatures, but also that by his wonderful counsel they are all directed to some specific end. Eighthly, fate, which the Stoics teach, is a necessity arising from a perpetual concatenation and intricate series of causes contained in nature. We admit not the term fate, but rather make God the arbiter and governor of all things, who in his own wisdom has from the remotest eternity decreed what he would do, and now, by his own power, executes what he has decreed. Therefore, as Basil the Great observed, fortune and chance are words used by the heathen, with the signification of which words the pious ought not to be occupied. What is commonly termed fortune, Augustine says, is regulated by a secret order, and what we call chance is only that with the reason and cause of which we are not acquainted. Instead of saying fortune, men ought to say, this was the will of God. For if anything be left to fortune, the world revolves at random. Ninthly, I would add that what we regard as fortuitous is not that fortune holds any dominion over the world or mankind, and whirls about all things at random, but because the order, reason, end, and necessity of events are chiefly concealed in the purpose of God, and not comprehended by the mind of man. Those things are in some measure fortuitous, which must happen according to divine will. Let us suppose, for example, that a merchant, having entered a wood in the company of honest men, imprudently wanders from his companions, and falls into the hands of robbers, and is murdered. His death was not only foreseen by God, but also decreed by him. See Job chapter 14, verse 5. Job chapter 14, verse 5 says, seeing his days are determined, the number of his months are with thee. Thou hast appointed his bounds that he cannot pass. Yet, as far as our minds are capable of comprehending, all these circumstances appear fortuitous. What opinion shall a Christian form on this case? He will consider all the circumstances of such a death as in their nature fortuitous. Yet he will not doubt that the providence of God presided and directed fortune to that end. There is no event, either past, present, or future, which God has not ordained. In this sense, the word chance is frequently repeated in Ecclesiastes. An eminent example of how God, by the reins of providence, directs all events according to his pleasure is David's being overtaken by Saul in the wilderness of Maon. At this very juncture, the Philistines made an irruption in the land, which compelled Saul to depart from pursuing David. This surely happened not by chance. What to man seems a contingency, faith will acknowledge to have been a secret impulse of God. It is not always that there appears a similar reason, but it should be considered indubitably certain that all the revolutions visible in the world proceed from the secret exertion of the divine power. What God decrees must necessarily come to pass, yet not by absolute or natural necessity.
If you would like to follow the rest of this series, please hit the subscribe button. If you enjoyed our content, please support us by liking, sharing, and leaving us a positive review on our channel.